Good evening. This is from Vacaville, California, medical facility. Cat Town in Spanish. And my name is Charles Manson Rasputin Scott Kilgore Jr. I also go under the names of Luther Maddox, Charles Deere, Charlie Deere, Louis Cavender, Bill Thomas, William Sergeant Bartlett, Count von Bruno, and Riff Raff Rackus. But there's two of us in Riff Raff Rackus.
Hello, everybody. We are back with a new episode of This is Darkness. Very pleased to have Nikolas Schreck on the show again. We spoke with him a while back about his music, and today we are here to speak directly about the spiritual aspect of Charles Manson. Nikolas Schreck has covered the topic of Charles Manson many times in the past through interviews. There's a lot of amazing content on this topic out there, but he doesn't get asked nearly enough about the spiritual side of Charles Manson, which to me has always been the most interesting element. And we've been able to get little tidbits of this out of Nikolas over the years, but to have an interview that's focusing specifically on this concept with Charles Manson, I think is going to be really nice and illuminating for people. And as the book is getting ready to drop just as we are having this conversation, and it'll probably be even closer by the time it releases. So you guys will see that have purchased the book that this is certainly not the only thing covered, but it is the most central, I think, to both of us when related to the topic of Charles Manson. And you will see that Nikolas has put a lot of time and energy into really illuminating this for us in the book. So I wanted to say here at the beginning that for me, my interests with Charles Manson have really, as I said, started with the spiritual element. And I thought the crime element was interesting, and I've looked into it, but some particular quotes of Charlie's have really stood out to me over the years. And as I have tried to get back into sort of more esoteric versions of religion after being an atheist for nearly 20 years, I really still couldn't wrap my mind around the idea of God. And some various quotes of Charlie's really brought that idea of God into perspective for me. And Nikolas really lays out in the book how Charlie went from sort of a standard Christian upbringing to the esoteric ideas that he developed over the years. So that's a thing that I'm really interested in talking about here today. And I'll go ahead and welcome you, Nikolas. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for your hospitality. I didn't know everybody was watching it, but you said hello, everybody. So I will also give my salutations to everybody who's watching this. And thank you for inviting me, and I am indeed looking forward to discussing this with you.
Well, if everybody isn't watching, they indeed should be.
Right.
So I guess I'd like for you to start today with talking a little bit about the groundwork that Charlie's spirituality was built upon, because as I said, people really, really know about Charles Manson through Helter Skelter, and things are becoming more clear over the years with the work that you've done and with the book Chaos, which sort of clarifies things in one direction and blurs them even further in another direction, but it's at least starting to dispel the Helter Skelter myth.
Well, and also George Stimson with Goodbye Helter Skelter.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Jeffrey Melnick with his book Creepy Crawling, which is from a liberal academic, basically saying Bugliosi was a liar.
And Lynette's book Reflection, which is probably my favorite read.
Yeah, Lynette Fromm's book doesn't really come right out and say that, but it makes it clear. And And even James Buddy Day, who wrote this not very well-known book, Hippie Cult Leader, completely refutes Bugliosi. So I'm very happy to see that I'm not the only voice in the wilderness. As I wrote in the introduction to the Manson File, we are now in the post-Bugliosi era of Mansonology, and we can leave Bugliosi behind us. I mean, unfortunately, for years, you had to spend more time explaining why he was wrong than what actually happened. And now I think we finally, with intelligent people, of course, idiots are always going to go for Bugliosi's story. They need to. They can't let it go. But for those who have some objectivity, I think his reputation has been totally demolished by all those people. And I certainly am not humble. I certainly helped to destroy it too. But I mean, I have been declaring what happened in the court in 1970 and 71 to be a show trial since 1988. Yes. So it's nothing new to me, but I'm glad to see that, that other people are adding to it, and it's slowly changing the public opinion about that. But enough of Vincent, who really, like most people who wrote about Charlie, wouldn't know a mystical experience if it bit them on the ass, and yet they have the audacity to say, well, he was just talking mumbo jumbo, and he was a con man, and yes, he was a criminal and a con man, but the fact is he did have genuine mystical awareness, and that's perhaps one of the ambiguities and contradictions about this fascinating and almost impossible to fully understand person, is that how he was absolutely a criminal, but he also had a high level of natural mystical understanding, not learned, not something he picked up from some cult or some teacher. And that's what mysticism is. It very often is something that naturally comes to you, and through the odd combination of trauma and isolation from society and karma, of course. It has to come from karmic past lives. Who was this person? But he was a genuine mystic, and he was a criminal. And I think people find it very hard to grasp how can that dichotomy be. And that's why the subtitle of my book, Outlaw Shaman, he's both. And you can be both,
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think you could start with talking a little bit about his heavily Christian upbringing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Charlie came particularly from a Christian organization called the Church of the Nazarene that was particularly focused on sinfulness, on that women need to behave with propriety. I think a big part of his religious upbringing was shame about sexuality, because the Church of the Nazarene is extremely prudish, even more than other, and in the South, in Ashland, Kentucky, even more so than usual. And I think also you have to look at his mother, who was not this, whore of Babylon that he and other people represent her as, but she was, she wasn't living up to the standards of the Church of the Nazarene. And so her you have to understand, he grew up as a child with the idea that his mother is this disgraceful scarlet woman and, this sinner. And I think that had a big part of his identity of who he was. And she also, Ben Gurecki has discovered many real pictures of his mother. Previously, we had seen pictures that were represented as her that were not even her. And this is just a simple, pragmatic fact of his life that's important psychologically. He looked very much like her. She looked like him. And they had this very tense, terrible, dysfunctional relationship, love-hate relationship. And, if you look like your mother, and she's considered to be a sinner, a whore by her family. She wasn't really, but she was rejected as such in the small town southern atmosphere of the Church of the Nazarene. His idea of sin, was really drummed into him. And also as a little kid, going to school, to the very little extent that he was able to go to school or in his community, everyone would be whispering about him. He's the son of that that whore, that criminal, that thief who, his first memories of her are her being sent to prison and him literally being traded in for a mug of beer, which did actually happen. That's not a folk tale. It's been recorded in police records in Kentucky. So that has nothing to do with his spirituality, but it has something to do with he had a yearning for truth, and he definitely felt an affinity with the Christ consciousness, which we'll get into. He had this particular concept of Christ that has been very much misunderstood, but he was dissatisfied with what he called, and other critics of traditional Christianity, churchianity, like this pious, goody-goody version of Christianity that is basically like the handmaiden of society, rather than how he saw Jesus, which is as this very radical mystic who's saying to reject the world as you know it. I mean, and I come not to bring peace, but I bring a sword. Far from extolling family virtues, the Jesus, even what little bit of the true Gnostic Jesus that speaks in the Old Testament, and most of it is edited out, he's a revolutionary, he's a radical, and he is telling people X themselves from society. And far from, as I was saying, far from encouraging family values, he says, get up and follow me out into the desert, give up everything. So that was the Jesus that Charlie felt a connection to.
Yes, and so as you said there, his family is of the Church of the Nazarene, but then not too long after he left his family at 9 years old, then he ended up in two different Catholic establishments. So can you talk a little bit about how that happened and how that further complicated and solidified his considerations of Christ and Christianity in general?
Right, like a lot of, or almost everything that happened to Charlie with his peculiar destiny of everything getting fucked up and upside down and backwards, they considered, because his name was Manson, must be Irish, therefore must be Irish Catholic, when his mother basically abandoned him and, to get rid of him, to get him out of her life, because a particular boyfriend of hers found him annoying and objectionable and cramping his style, and she put him into the juvenile reform system. He ended up at the Gibalt School for Boys, which is a Roman Catholic institute. And anybody who's even seen some of Charlie's interviews will see that he was obsessed with the Pope, with the very concept of Roman Catholicism. And he connected it to the mafia, very often use it as even an analog or a synonym for the mafia. So he came from clan country of Ashland, Kentucky, the Church of the Nazarene. And, maybe people who don't know the American South who are listening to this, in the environment of the Church of the Nazarene in the Deep South, or in Kentucky particularly, but that whole area, the idea from evangelicals and Protestants is that the Roman Catholic Church is the Antichrist, and that the Pope is, the devil incarnate. And Charlie grew up with that idea. But then, so imagine he is being raised by, and he made a point of saying at Gibalt Boys School, that was the first time he encountered a religious brotherhood of monks, which he, weirdly for most people seems counterintuitive. That's what he looked at as his commune, a brotherhood and sisterhood of religion, of a rebirth movement, as he called it. So I think this being raised by monks was very important in his spiritual development. He disliked their discipline and their severity, but he admired their religious dedication. So yeah, he grew up in this Roman Catholic environment, and then his deep connection to the mafia, which began very early with his dealings with the major mafioso figure Frank Costello when he was very young in the 50s, and continued with people like Frankie Carbo and other major mafia people. He looked at he called himself the Pope. He was obsessed with the papacy, with the Roman Catholic Church. And I mean, I hardly an interview I did with him that I can think of where he didn't bring up Roman Catholicism in some way. And there's one conversation we had, which I have a tape of, in which he talks about how important it is to unite the Roman Catholic and Protestant wings of the church again and bring one. I mean, he was really, people who think he was just a con man who used religious terminology to trick people to kill, he was obsessed with religious ideas of every kind, and not just Christianity, and he was very familiar with them. True, he was not well educated, but he suffered from severe dyslexia, but he read very widely, and I would say he read about religion all the time, and that was something we discussed. Music and religion is what we talked about. Maybe people have the impression that I just interrogated him about crimes constantly. That was the exception, not the rule. So, he was a mystic who was interested in and exploring. He was on a spiritual quest, and traditional Christianity did not fulfill that quest. And I think an important part of it is the Church of the Nazarenes' rejection of sexuality. He very much saw sexuality as a sacred right, and saw the alchemical union of male and female as being the ultimate mystical experience. So that was in complete contradiction to what he was raised with.
Yes, and just to touch a little bit there, one of the things that stood out to me and other people that I've sort of in my personal life sort of drawn into, like, hey, look at a little bit of this interview, is the thing that stands out is that he'll go off on like a little tangent, and he might just mention something for a second or two and then move on, and somebody will say, well, what do you mean by that, Charlie? And he'll just go into thorough detail. He'll mention something of just totally off the wall that usually has some relation to some other spirituality, and right. he really is just you think, like, if you just listen to him on the surface, like, oh, he's just bullshitting about this and that and this and that, but every time somebody stops and says, what do you mean by that, Charlie? There's the next half hour where he's telling you exactly what he meant by that one little half sentence.
Right. And of course, most of the mainstream hot seat interviews where they basically just had some moron representing traditional society coming to rattle his cage and to get the monster to say something frightening, he gave them that. But if you look at the full interviews, the unedited interviews, he's always getting back to spiritual concerns that, unfortunately, the dimwits that interviewed him, for the most part, not only have no interest in it, they have no knowledge. And I think that's why one of the many reasons that Charles is so misunderstood. And I don't say that like he was a poor little victim that, was not a violent criminal. He certainly was.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
But the people who've written about him were not mystics themselves, and most of them had a lot of skepticism. Part of the whole Republican conservative rejection of hippiedom in the 60s of the Nixon regime was stamping out any kind of alternative spirituality to traditional American style Puritan Christianity. And a lot of people's biases and prejudices about communes, about group sex, about the word guru, which is a perfectly noble word and a word of dignity and respect, has become an insult. You say, oh, someone's just a guru. And that really started to happen in the late 60s during the demonization of alternative spirituality of any kind, as if every guru or as if every spiritual authority is a manipulative predator.
Yeah, and it's even worse right now with the sort of the new Netflix craze, where you have Wild Wild Country that talks about Osho, and you have I can't remember the guy's name, but the hot yoga one from Los Angeles, where the worst examples always get a two-part, two-season documentary.
right, absolutely. But the idea that by the fact that people spontaneously were drawn to Charles because he did have a natural wisdom, and he did have a philosophy, and he did inspire people for the better, and he inspired them for the worse. Both. You know, and that's Abraxas, which we have to understand his comprehension of Abraxas, this duality. But, you know, I can't tell you how many prisoners I've known through Charlie who spoke of him as somebody who transformed them, who changed them, who actually encouraged them to be less violent, less hateful, more at peace with themselves. And he took a sort of pastoral role to other prisoners. And he had this very deep affinity to other prisoners, particularly in the underworld. And you know, sure, some people hated him too, or felt competition with him, but a lot of the convicts who I met through Charlie over the many years that we knew each other looked at him like their spiritual guide. So, I mean, I know for most people that's a horrifying idea that he could have a benevolent effect on people, but I saw that he did.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking on the guru topic, one of the questions I wanted to ask is in relation to you know, the Beach Boys went to India and they met Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And, you know, for people that don't know, he was the creator of transcendental, or at least the trademarker of transcendental meditation.
Actually, this is interesting, a digression, but an important one. Probably most people who don't know a lot about these subjects would say, well, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was a legitimate, you know, master, and Charlie Manson was this con man pretending to be a guru. On the contrary, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was a total con man, running a pyramid scheme exactly like L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology, except using Indian mysticism. He was actually the bookkeeper, the accountant for a guru, and he saw that Westerners were so naive and so desperate for spiritual knowledge, and he packaged it and sold it. But, you know, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was out and out con man. And as you say, the Beach Boys, actually, Mike Love went to Rishikesh with the Beatles and Mia Farrow, and all of that has a strange connection to the whole Manson mythos, which I get into the book, that whole meeting. The Maharishi is kind of the anti-Manson. People don't realize it. First, the Beatles adopted him and rejected him, but the Beach Boys, much more than the Beatles, they actually went out and performed with him. They did this disastrous tour, which was half of him giving a lecture and them playing, and people walked out when the Maharishi spoke. No one was interested in it. It was a financial disaster. So Dennis Wilson had met the Maharishi in Wales, and Mike Love had met him at Rishikesh with the Beatles, and he became their guru. But the Beach Boys always, and Brian Wilson especially, and Dennis, always had some spiritual father figure. And we can get into how much the psychology of Murray Wilson, this horrible, dysfunctional, violent, abusive father of the Beach Boys, led to a certain extent to Dennis's fascination with Charlie as a father figure. But like people like Billy Hinch, a musician who knew Charlie and knew Dennis and knew the Beach Boys, he remembered when the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was replaced by Charlie. I mean, that's the way it was, that was their guru, and then they replaced it with Charlie. And it wasn't just Dennis. Brian Wilson, Carl Wilson, they also looked up to him, no matter how much Beach Boys whitewashers and fans would like to.
I was going to say that line has been definitely blurred between, you know, they really try to focus on it was just Dennis.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, from what Charlie said, and you know, this is over many years, and I don't think he was bragging. And I've said this before, I almost got the impression, and they did this with other people like Glenn Campbell and Billy Hinch and a few other musicians, that they kind of wanted to make him part of the band for a while, which, you know, at that time they were desperate for credibility and to be hip. But we don't want to veer too much into music. The point is, even though music too, of course, was incredibly spiritual to Charlie, and it was as he said, it was a religion to him. Sound and music, making a joyful noise unto the Lord, was very important in his spiritual development and teaching. But so you got to understand, that's good that you brought that up. Charlie's one of several gurus in the Beach Boys story. Then there was Eugene Landy, who became Brian Wilson's totally manipulative con man of a psychiatrist who just ruined his life. So, you know, Charlie is part of a larger process in the Beach Boys history of them looking for a guru or a spiritual father figure because of their very, you know, fucked up relationship with Murray Wilson, this very brutal and insulting father who damaged all of his family. So that's important to understand. And in the context of the 60s, Charlie was absolutely seen as a teacher, and that was not uncommon. You know, on every street corner there was a messiah, a guru. He's been made to look unique, but he had plenty of competition in Haight-Ashbury and in Los Angeles in the music world.
Yeah, and on that, I wanted to take it sort of back into the Christianity direction for a little bit. Directly related to what we're talking about here is his connection with, if you could speak a little bit about the film that he was advising on and what his role was in advising that film.
I think for those who are not, you know, au fait with the deeper saga of the Manson story, most people's idea of Charlie is he must have frightened everyone immediately. And when you hear anecdotes from show business people who pretend they didn't know him, they'll say, oh yeah, I knew he was a creep and a liar and a manipulator right away. We didn't want anything to do with him. On the contrary, 3 months, he gets out of prison in March, and to tie into this Christian thing, which is deeply woven into this 3 years, and of course Christ had a 3-year ministry, and Charlie was very aware of that. He had that 3 years out of freedom, and that was his ministry. I want to go back to the day he got out of prison, which was, it's also symbolic. It was the spring equinox that Charlie was released from prison, 1967. Oh, wow. And he made a big deal of the fact that out in the parking lot of the prison, the only person there was the prison chaplain. And he took that as one of many signs that he had some sort of religious mission. Which of course rationalists will look at as some sort of delusion of grandeur, but I happen to believe it was sincere, and that other people immediately picked up on that. He had some sort of vision. So he gets out of prison. He immediately sees a pastor, and Charlie was always interpreting everything symbolically. If people think interpreting a Beatles song, he interpreted, you know, every time I saw him, he interpreted what color shirt I wore, or what chair were we sitting on, or what music was playing, or, you know, he was a symbol interpreter constantly. So he looked at that as the beginning of his spiritual journey with this pastor. And then 3 months after getting out of prison, far from being this wannabe loser who nobody took seriously, on the musical level, he's got Russ Regan, who is the head of Uni Records, paying this convict to go into Gold Star Studios, one of the best studios at the time, where Phil Spector and Sonny Bono and everyone in the music industry worked, to give Charlie money to make a demo. And they were very encouraging about it. And Gary Stromberg, who was a friend of Phil Kaufman, who Charlie met in prison and who was Charlie's connection at Uni Records, was writing a screenplay about the second coming of Jesus for Universal Pictures. And so Charlie ended up being a guest on the Universal lot, 3 months coming out of prison with no future, no money, no connections. He's informally a technical advisor who's parking in Cary Grant's parking place and giving technical advice. And how did people see him before they knew he was the evil cult leader, Charlie Manson? They saw him as this Christian, wise sage. And so Gary Stromberg and his partner hired Charlie to help them put some authentic religiosity and spirituality into their script about the second coming of Jesus. So that was one of his first legitimate, you know, he's immediately in And again, with Charlie's constantly symbolically interpreting everything, he told me when he brought the bus into Universal Studios, he said, I then entered the universal mind. And he said he saw the corruption, what is behind, what is, you know, the darkness there in the universal mind. So this is how Charlie thought, because that studio's universal, he's in the universal mind. And he saw these things like a symbolic, mythical, he saw his life like an epic, like he was hired to talk about the second coming of Jesus, but then he rejected it because, of course, he didn't like Gary Stromberg's idea. And Gary Stromberg was married to a black actress, a comedian who appeared on Laugh-In, who actually liked Charlie, and Charlie liked her, but Charlie didn't approve, as we know, of miscegenation at all. So he turned down this job. It wasn't that nobody wanted him. He turned down the job because he did not approve that they were going to make a black Jesus, woke before their time and diverse before their time. So he dropped out of it. So two important things there. How did people see him? And you can read Gary Stromberg's very favorable comments of Charlie's spiritual wisdom at that time. That's how he was seen, not as a satanic monster. On the contrary, as somebody who Universal Studios would hire to advise on a religious film. So I think that's very important to understand. That's the way people saw him. And as I pointed out before, a lot of the hip Hollywood crowd didn't see Charlie and his commune as dangerous and frightening. They saw them as a little bit square and goody-goody because they were always talking about Jesus and love and Christ. And that's the last thing a lot of these hedonists wanted to hear about.
Yeah, and so this all sort of came together as this idea of Christ conscious. And then, so I want you to speak a little bit about what that means, and also sort of either solidify or dispel the idea of Charlie thinking he was the return of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I learned, I mean, I heard him, of course, we spoke about Gnosticism and Christianity all the time, and he would refer to Bible passages constantly. I mean, that was his frame of reference, and he read the King James Bible and Shakespeare. He loved that kind of Elizabethan language. So the King James Bible was very important to him. He always referred to it. But Charlie's understanding of Jesus, and this is something I only came to understand in like the last 10 years of our knowing each other. Charlie was loath to admit that he ever had a mentor or a teacher. He would admit it with crime. He would admit that Frankie Carbo was his mentor, Frank Costello, or Alvin Karpis. About crime, he was humble and said, I learned everything from these gangsters. But when it came to spiritual things, he was a little cagey about admitting that he ever had an influence. But as I got to know him better, he admitted that the yogi Parahamsa Yogananda was a very major influence on his spirituality. When he was a young man, he went to learn to meditate at this self-realization center in Los Angeles when he was a beatnik. And there were a lot of bohemian beatnik types like Aldous Huxley, Gerald Hurd, other people who eventually became figures in this later psychedelic movement were also involved with Yogananda's movement. So Yogananda, interestingly, for an Indian guru, emphasized the Christ consciousness. He believed that Christ was a spiritual master and a guru, but what he taught is that every man is Christ, or every human being, and he referred to it as the Christ consciousness, not a person. You could compare it to in Tantric Buddhism, the spirit of the Bodhisattva. It's not in which every Buddhist can become the Buddha. We are all a Buddha. So, and very similar to Gnostic forms of Christianity, if we can misuse that word Gnostic, which the people who are called that actually didn't call themselves. But let's say esoteric Christianity, the idea that it's not about worshiping a particular person, but and Jesus says it, become like me, be as I am. And that's what Charlie took seriously from Yogananda's teaching. And I looked into it after Charlie told me how much Yogananda influenced his. Actually, he was negative about Christianity from his youth when he got involved with this Yogananda Self-Realization Center. But their idea of Christ consciousness appealed to him, that the Christ consciousness is something within all of us, like the gnosis. It's like the spark of infinite wisdom that is veiled by the kleshas or obscurations of, of this material world. So
Yeah.
when Charlie said, that he is Jesus, he would also say that so are you. And he always did, but people ignore that part.
Yeah, this is the part that confuses people so much, and why you said that, people that don't understand spirituality in depth really shouldn't question him on these topics, because he makes a statement like, I am the Christ. And they don't ever, they either ignore or don't dig further in to find out that he means, no, so are you, so is that guy, the
Well,
cameraman is, the person
he,
interviewing me is, I am,
yeah,
everybody is.
right.
They never would let him get that far.
No, he always said that. And as I point out in the Manson File, in the Wizard chapter, this is also something in the esoteric form of Islam. In Sufism, you had many Sufi teachers who said, I am Allah, I am Muhammad. And they were considered heretics, but they were saying, we are all, we are all the prophet. Yeah, there is an esoteric side to all the forms of the Abrahamic religion, which is about God within you. The kingdom of heaven is within you. And that is what Charlie was talking about. And really, I've never seen an interview with him or when he's talking about I am Jesus, where he doesn't say, and so are you, and you're also the devil, and you're also everything, which if you've even, bothered to look into Mysticism 101, this is just non-dualism. We are potentially everything. We are divinity. Divinity is us, and that's what he was saying. Of course, because of Helter Skelter and Bugliosi's twisting of the narrative to turn everything about Charlie into a murder motive, or a look how the manipulative cult leader convinced people to kill for him, which is not relevant to his spiritual and religious teaching. So, yeah, and of course, he was also influenced without a doubt by Krishnaventa, and who was also a criminal, and now I think he was a total fake. I don't think Krishnaventa, from what I've looked into, had any spiritual wisdom. He did seem like a total con man, a criminal, but he too was just like Charlie, ex-convict who started a group of women large. I think the Order of the Rainbow and Outlaw were very influenced by Fountain of the World and Krishnaventa. And that was, for people who don't know, this Fountain of the World was a religious sect right next to the Spahn Ranch. And there was a certain fluidity and commonality between the two groups, between Charlie's commune and the Fountain of the World. So he wasn't trying to be Krishnaventa, but he did feel a karmic connection to him. And Krishnaventa was in the 50s, already had long hair, a beard, barefoot, wearing robes. For all effects and purposes, the Fountain of the World were proto-hippies 10 years before there was a counterculture. So I would say Yogananda had a much more important influence on Charlie's understanding of this Christ consciousness, not being this particular person, but that Jesus was a vehicle. And this is tying into the more Gnostic idea that Christ is not the son of Yahweh, or Ialdabaoth, who is a imposter god, but is a spirit that was sent by Abraxas, who is the true transcendent Godhead above this imposter god, Ialdabaoth, who is known as Yahweh or Jehovah. And Charlie definitely had a Gnostic view of Christianity. So yeah, he was not a delusional psychopath who literally thought that he was Jesus. He understood he was Jesus-like, and and that so are you. And he said it to me, you know, you would be God, you would be Satan. He said things like that all the time to everybody, to prison guards. And so that's the important thing to understand about it, is it's a very personal understanding. And now I have to add one other thing, is that to the degree that he did identify with Jesus, there is this idea in Christian mysticism of imitatio Dios, or imitation of the god, that and this is true even in Egyptian and Greek and Roman magic, or all magical pantheons. If you are a disciple of a particular deity, you try to make your life like that deity. And Charlie definitely believed that his trial and his long period of incarceration was a crucifixion. He did believe that he was suffering for humanity, as crazy as that may sound to other people. He absolutely believed it. It wasn't a con, because he was consistent about that. He did believe he had to deal with this being this horrific scapegoat for everybody's projections of evil. I mean, imagine what that's like, to wake up every day with these incredible cartoonish misconceptions of you as the most evil person who's ever existed, and what that does to your mind. So an important part of his Christ consciousness was, I'm taking on the hatred for everybody. I'll take it on. I will be your scapegoat. You can blame me for everything. I did everything. And that too, he was being like Jesus. In that way, he was trying to be a good Christian, and maybe more diligently than the average socially acceptable Christian who just goes to church on Sunday. He genuinely believed that part of the Christian spiritual experience is to suffer, to accept suffering. And as the Buddha said, all is suffering in this world of samsara. But because Charlie had so much grief, you know, from his childhood on, this incredibly difficult life that he had, much of which he brought on himself, let's face it, but he had this, you know, but having the hatred of the entire world focused on him because of the media inflaming this myth about him, he turned that into an advantage for himself on an initiatory level. And kind of, if you look into in Sufism, the way of malamat, of being deliberately disrespected, to be hated, is in a way to become spiritually redeemed. And this gets into the transgressions of the true left-hand path, not what people think the left-hand path is. I can't get into that in this conversation. We will another time for sure. But there, and in this regard, in the Manson File, you saw I get into the idea of the holy fool, of someone who is deeply religious, but who flaunts the taboos of society. And there's a long tradition of that in every genuine spiritual tradition, like St. Francis of Assisi and many others more radical than him. And in Tantric Buddhism, we have this concept as well of transgressing the rules to demonstrate a spiritual wisdom that goes beyond social convention. And that's called crazy wisdom in Tantric Buddhism. And Charlie, to an amazing degree, though he wasn't book learned, really reflected this idea of crazy wisdom in Tantric Buddhism, of being a mirror, of just reflecting what is coming to you without judging it, of becoming it, of also, you know, it's a cliche, but of not having ego. I think that's important to get into too. But back to your questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you are getting directly into the next one I was going to ask here. So, one of the quotes that's really resonated with me over the years from Charlie, since the first time I heard it: "The way out isn't through the door." So in the Manson File, you say Charlie thought his cell was a platonic cave, and that he got out of the world itself. That when he got out, the world itself was equally illusory. If you could explain that a little bit.
Well, he was very firm in this concept that he was always in prison. Like he was prison. Like even when he got out, he was still in prison, and it was his home. I mean, he didn't know anything else. It's hard for people to grasp a life in which that is your home. You don't know. He just was institutionalized from, from 9 and 12 years old, completely institutionalized. So he felt that he was, well, the other important thing about it is that he, and this is true, I have seen this to be true with other prisoners, as harsh and horrible as prison is, and I'm certainly not romanticizing it in any way, shape, or form. It's brutal and horrible and an awful, desolate experience. But it is like a monastery to a certain extent, in that you are forced to give up social convention. You have to give up your ego, because you have lost all rights. You are nobody. And you have, and if you're a spiritual person, you can take even a terrible experience like prison and turn it into a humbling experience. You have to deal with people who you certainly may not like on a daily level. You have to maneuver in a very difficult situation. So, and I get into this in the Manson File, in that chapter, The Wizard, how to a certain extent prison was Charlie's monastery, and going into his cell was like a monk in retreat, and he was very aware of that. And but he saw, like kind of like in the true Superman comics, Bizarro world, he saw prison as the real world and the outer world as a projection of things that began in the underworld. And on a deeper level, he believed that crime is what was the true root of the outer world that pretends to be good and law-abiding, but actually that underneath it all, it comes from the underworld, which is a very mystical concept. And, to most people that seems like, mumbo jumbo, but he really believed it. He believed that the highest level of government had its roots that you couldn't see deep in the underworld. And I'm not going to make anyone angry, but as far as we can see now, that's become quite evident, where you have criminals running governments quite blatantly and nobody minds. So I think that part of his understanding of reality is totally true. So does that answer your question a bit? Does that get to what you were?
Yeah, I think so. And a little bit further, I guess, in this direction, can you talk about how Charlie cultivated a state of non-judgmental contentment for whatever this moment offers, and how this connects to the tantric teacher Chogyam Trungpa? Sorry if I mispronounced his name.
No, that's good. Yeah, very well. When I was fairly young, in my late 20s, Charlie had this very long 2-part conversation with me, in which I don't really talk about this in the book, but this chapter, The Wizard, is very much based on things that we had a conversation about. And I'll get into what the root of this wizard chapter was another book that Charlie proposed that we work on, called The Mind of Charles Manson. And I'll get into that a bit. But there was a 2-part conversation I had with Charlie on the phone from prison, where he was very urgently trying to get me to understand the idea of acceptance. And he wrote it in capitals, acceptance, like it's very important. At the heart of Charlie's teaching was the idea that there is, and of course, this is the perennial philosophy of mysticism. It's not like he invented it or learned it from someone. He knew it. Is the inner wisdom that you get through mystical experience, is that this moment now, coming to now, is all there is. The past, the second before of what we were saying, is totally gone. It's completely gone. There's no trace of it. It may be recorded, but it's gone. There's only this moment. And no matter what this moment brings us, we have to be totally in love with it. That was a very important part of his teaching. Even if it's horrible, like in one of his interviews, and he paraphrased this many times, like Jesus on the cross, he would say, yes, put the nail in. That can seem like some kind of masochism, but it's basically acceptance was this thing he really pushed on me when he was, he thought this was very crucial for me to understand whatever, and I did learn that lesson, and I have found it useful, extremely useful. And Charlie's teaching is not useful to a conventional person who's a part of universities or the academy or society or corporations. It's fairly useless for that kind of person. But if you have yourself from society, as I did long before Charlie, and which I think many people who find him of value, it is very useful. So acceptance means whatever is happening, it's the way it's supposed to be, and don't fight it. Don't try to get away from it. Don't try to change it. And he would often say, perfection as it is. It's perfect. Everything is perfect as it is. That's including being in prison in the miserable conditions he was in. And he did have genuine joy and bliss compared to most people. Now, of course, he had his dark moods. He had his bad, angry moods. He was a human being. But even in prison, I'd see that he, for the most part, practiced what he preached. Now, how many of us can say that we are totally accepting of what's happening to us in our life? That we understand it's our karma and then just let it be without trying to change it, without trying to transform it. And that is very much, as you said, one of the teachings of this Tantric Buddhist master, very controversial also, Chogyam Trungpa, who also taught just exactly like Charlie, and it's a teaching in Sufism, be a mirror. Reflect what's happening, don't judge it, don't say this is good, bad, or indifferent. And that again is non-dualism, which is very hard for the conventional dualistic mind to understand, because the uninitiated person is constantly saying this is good, this is bad, I like this, I don't like that, not judging, letting it be, and a total acceptance of the moment that's, I would say, key to what Charlie taught and what he demonstrated to other people. That he could be joyful in chains, that he could be, on one hand, having no freedom whatsoever. You can't wear that, Manson. You can't do that. You have to stay here. I mean, think of how constrained his life was for 60 years and more of his life, not being able to decide what he could eat, where he could go, what he could wear, and yet he was free within. For the most part, he did have his flaws, and there were elements of contradiction. And one that I'll bring up, like he taught everyone he knew to transcend the social conditioning of their family, of the mother mind, as he would call it. But I have to say, he himself didn't do that at all. That was a glaring inconsistency, in that he was totally, when he was in his 70s, he was still a damaged little boy who had been very traumatized by his negative relation with his mother, who he never forgave and always had very bitter, so he taught people transcend the social conditioning of the mother mind. He himself, I don't think, succeeded in doing that.
Yeah. And then another thing I wanted you to talk about a little bit while we're still on the topic of sort of the Eastern traditions being melded into what he was doing. So on my shirt here that people can sort of have a look at,
Right.
Red and blue both are holding this one finger mudra that you talked a little bit about in the book. So if you could explain that mudra a little bit, because I think people have seen it a
Right.
lot.
Well, basically this, and Charlie, okay, now remember, it's in the social context of the 1960s when everyone is doing the peace symbol. To Charlie's mind, he was on one hand, he told people he was the real hippie, but on the other hand, he was an anti-hippie. And typical of him, he's a contradiction about everything. There's a yes and a no and a maybe about everything with him. So to a certain sense, think of, 67 to 69, every long-haired person is, peace. So his answer to that was all is one. Everything is one. And again, it's the basic core mystical teaching of the unity of all things. And I mean, in a letter he wrote to me, which I quote in the Manson File, which is quite simple but very profound, because it is the ultimate truth of emptiness and what is considered wisdom in the Eastern tradition, is there's only one. I mean, he said there's no such thing as two, man. There's just one thing. And he totally understood that. He really did live it and see it. And also he told me that when they experimented with these, the media would call it orgies, he looked at it as like a Christian sexual agape. The point of these orgies was not merely hedonism. Not that he didn't enjoy sex, of course he did, but it was to try for the commune to reach a kind of unified mind through unified orgasm and becoming one completely. And that doing that with psychedelic drugs is an extremely powerful thing that creates a group dynamic. And so he told me that when someone was going to have an orgasm, they would do the one, and that everyone would try to match them. And he said they never did get to that point exactly, but certainly, so that's what. And there were many other hand gestures which he never explained to me. That was one that was quite clear, and he did, but he had all kinds of hidden hand gestures, which were somewhat influenced by criminal gangs that have ways of communicating with gesture. Also the Freemasons. He used body to communicate as much as he did words. And when you were with him in person, he very much used body language and expression to say something deeper than what the words were saying. That's something you could only experience in person, I think. So that's what the one is. It just means the truth is one, all is one. And, again, that's not in contradiction with all the great mystical traditions of the world. The Pope wouldn't disagree with that. The Dalai Lama wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah, and so I'll want to come back on this all is one concept in a few moments, but I have to get this in. I'd like you to speak a little bit about the way of the bus and how that sort of connects into the magical mystery tour that they took from the Beatles. More, as you've said, more the girls focused on the magical mystery tour aspect of it, but the way of the bus and they were sort of the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, Charlie turned everything into a religious quest and a journey. So, just as he called the commune a rebirth movement when he talked to me about it and other people, that's how he saw it, was a movement for people to give up their social conditioning, which the Buliosian will say, right, to go kill people and commit crimes. Well, yes, that is true. And we do have to include that. Part of his genuine belief, and I've said this before, it wasn't just a con, he believed it. Your property is not yours, because if it's all one, it also belongs to me. Now that's true on a universal level. It's not true on a legal level. You can arrest me if but he believed that, and therefore he thought, well, I can take whatever I want because I give it to you. And he would, he would definitely. You can have that. And he even gave away the bus occasionally.
That was very powerful, finding out that he actually gave away the bus.
Right, and that's something that Gary Stromberg actually witnessed on a beach in Santa Monica, I think, that some envious guy said, oh, you with your girls and your bus, and you're not anti-materialistic, and he said, you can have them, take them. And I know that's what he was like. He was greedy, and he was a criminal who thought he had every right to steal from you because society had fucked him over. I don't necessarily agree with that part of his thought. But that's, if you want to understand the man, that was his approach. Like, you have taken all my rights, and therefore you have no rights. I can take whatever from you. But he also believed, I'll give you anything. Whatever you want, I'll give you. And he did. He gave money generously to many people. He offered it to me. He was, he had this idea that keeping everything in flow. So that was part of his oneness, including the criminality. Now, I didn't necessarily agree with that, but on a philosophical level, you can understand theoretically, he's saying nothing belongs to anyone. You don't even belong to yourself. This very simple line in one of his songs, you ain't Joe, you ain't Sam, you just am. That is very simple lyric, but it sums up his philosophy. We are experiencing this mysterious phenomena of consciousness, and we are nobody. And he said that all the time, I'm nobody. But that wasn't self-abnegation. That's the same thing that a monk in deep meditation would feel. I don't exist because I am part of such a vast, infinite, divine mystery that I don't exist. The I doesn't really exist. You know, and there's a conversation I have on my YouTube channel where he says in passing, you know, something like, I'm paraphrasing, you know, it's really hard for people to understand nothing's real. It's nothing's actually happening. And this is something that one of in my own spiritual lineage, the 16th Karmapa, who was the Karmapa, the leader of the Karmakaju Buddhist sect before this one, when he was dying of cancer, one of his disciples was crying. He was at a hospital in Chicago because his master was dying, and the Karmapa smiled and laughed, and the doctors were amazed. He felt no pain, even though he was suffering from fatal cancer. And he said to his disciple, "Nothing happens." And if you think about the simple profundity of that, that is something Charlie was very aware of, that this, and again, his song lyrics are his teaching. The illusion has just been a dream. That's exactly what you will realize when your consciousness separates from your body when you die. This thing that we're experiencing that we think is reality is an illusion. And he knew that. He knew that this was a very fluid mirage. And that's why he had this impish playfulness about life and even about serious things, you know, because he knew it was a game. He knew that this is not actually happening.
Yeah, and so to elaborate on that a little bit further, you point out that with the death penalty hanging over his head, Charlie stated that he'd already died years ago. I've personally heard him make similar statements, and I always thought he was talking about being a reincarnation of Jesus Christ. But then you explained in your book about the day that he turned everything off in solitary confinement in 1951. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, I believe, I'm not completely correct. I may be wrong. I think it was in Lewisburg Penitentiary when he was a teenager, practically in the 50s. He said he had this mystical experience of everything turned off. He no longer cared. Now, I don't think that was always consistent, because I saw him get angry about all kinds of petty bullshit and get into feuds with people. But you know, he wasn't perfect by any means. But for the most part, he really, I do think that happened. He had a mystical experience in solitary confinement. I believe it was in Lewisburg Penitentiary when he was in solitary. And he said, he always referred to it as a landmark in his initiation. And he was an initiate. I know that the average Buliosian will think, oh, this guy's crazy, thinking this psychopath is an initiate. But he was. And if you are on the spiritual quest, you recognize another person who is on that quest. And if you're not, you can't see it. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. So he had this mystical experience, and he had 3 mystical experiences he described to me and to many others that I think shaped him. There was that, and then he said, I became dead. And he often used this, I'm dead, that the people in the commune were deadheads. He had their head, not like fans of the Grateful Dead. He meant literally, and he didn't mean in a bad way. He meant, and actually Muhammad in the Quran says, die before you die. It's very hard for the average person to understand what that really means. It does cease to exist. Of course, the Buliosian literal-minded idiot will say, yeah, it's about killing and murder. No, it means the ego ceases to exist. The I ceases to exist. Nothing is actually happening. And so his songs, as seemingly simple folk songs that they are, his teaching is very much imbued in almost all of them. But to cease to exist, it doesn't mean to die, literally. It means to, as what Muhammad is saying, to die before you die, to give up your ego, to give up your grabbing and attachment to this material world, because we already are dead. We are the ghost. We are the reincarnated ghost of somebody who came before us. And Charlie was very aware of reincarnation. He was very clear that he definitely believed that he was a World War I soldier. He remembered being killed in World War I and realizing that death is nothing. Like, oh, okay, that was nothing. And that was important. He believed himself to be the reincarnation of Giordano Bruno, the Italian heretic and mystic who was killed as a heretic and for blasphemy. And he even called himself one of his criminal aliases. Cops would say, "Who are you?" He'd say, "Giordano Bruno." These are fascinating things about Charlie. Where did this, very uneducated guy who had very little exposure to any kind of teaching come to believe that he was the reincarnation of Giordano Bruno? And if your watchers will look into, you'll see there's certain parallels in their thought.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time looking into those parallels. Bruno is a really interesting figure. And as I said, I was going to attach onto the beginning of this interview the little excerpt from the AKA Abraxas tape, where
Right.
at the very start of the tape, Charlie introduces himself by like 15 different aliases, and
Right. Well,
Count
see
von
that.
Bruno is one of them. So
Yeah.
that
Count
Giordano Bruno is the one that he's speaking
Count
about.
Count von Bruno, the Black Pirate, was the official name of who he was. And also see, people don't understand the names that he gave, Sadie Mae Glutz, all these names. It's like now I understand. I mean, I can put on the hat of the Manson hater who says, yeah, he was destroying their ego so he could hypnotize them to kill. I understand that's your simple-minded view of it. He was genuinely trying to get them to give up their identities to become something divine. And that was, we didn't get further enough into the way of the bus and the magical mystery tour as Charlie saw it. And the girls were as much his teachers as he was theirs. It was a playful, I do agree with this group marriage idea. That's what it was. And they brought stuff to him, and it was like a constant role playing to keep the fluidity of identity from stagnating and solidifying, so that they were always somebody else. One day they were this, one day they were that, different names, and that confused people. And of course, and I never deny this with everything, there's the underworld criminal aspect of it. They were criminal aliases. If the cop asked who you are, you say Sadie Mae Glutz, not Susan Denise Atkins. That's a criminal reason, but it also had a spiritual purpose, is you are not you. You are not only you. You are more than that. And so this magical mystery tour, this playfulness, this fluidity of identity, that's a very important part of any mystical initiation.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a little bit on what you were saying there with him, it being sort of a reciprocal thing between him and the girls. In Lynette's book, Reflection, there was a really powerful moment that she talked about when I think they were on a trip, and somebody sort of said something about Charlie being the leader of the group, and Charlie's like, no, Lynette's the leader of the group. And then Lynette freaked out.
Right.
Because she's like, I'm not the leader, you're the leader. He's like, no, you're the leader. And she knew he meant it.
He did. And I actually believe, I remember once for a few years, he had these party line phone conversations that were difficult to arrange, where a bunch of people he knew would talk to him, and he would give sort of a sermon, and he would call it the riverboat, like we were all on a riverboat.
That's cool.
And I remember him saying in one of them that he was, and I believe this, it wasn't mock humble or mock bragging. He said, I'm not comfortable being the leader. I don't know why you're looking at me. I don't know anything. I'm an idiot. And he often said that. Don't look at me. I don't know anything. I've never, I didn't get beyond third grade. Don't ask me. He never, yes, there were elements of megalomania, but you can't ignore how often he said, I'm nobody. I'm just a hobo. I'm a bum in the street with a bottle of wine. I'm nobody. And I think he was uncomfortable with being a teacher. And that is the sign of a true teacher. Nobody would want it because it's a burden. it's a task to have people come to you for help and for wisdom, and they always did. So I think that's an important part of it too. It isn't like he embraced it. Yes, he sure liked to hear himself talk. He liked to ramble and philosophize, and he did give these sermons, but I think he was a bit uncomfortable with that, and he always wanted to say, well, you're my teacher. And actually it's something I think he picked up partially from the Diggers, which I mentioned in the Manson File, this counterculture group in the early days of the hippie movement in Haight-Ashbury. There's a famous story that's much told, an anecdote about it, where these journalists go in to interview this radical group, the Diggers, and it turns, and they think they're talking to the leader of the Diggers. And what they did was tell them to talk to other journalists. So they were tricking them that they thought that's the leader of the Diggers. And the two journalists are interviewing each other. Neither of them are even part of the Diggers. That's the kind of hippie guerrilla theater that Charlie played. And if you don't know the hippie movement, a lot of what the commune did seems bizarre, but this kind of guerrilla street theater, what they did in the courtroom was very much like what hippie street theater did, like subverting social relationships and the normal dynamics of how things are.
Yeah.
But I mean, he also said to Danny DiCarlo that Michael Brunner, Pooh Bear, was the leader, and he believed it. He said his little kid, his child, was the leader of the group, and many people said that. He said, this is something that I believe was influenced by Scientology, because L. Ron Hubbard, for some reason, was very obsessed with that idea too. I think Charlie picked it up from Dianetics, that look at the purity of children to learn how to be a better human being. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that part of Charlie's idea, and I don't agree with many parts of what he taught, but they're not madness. There is a method to what he believed. There is a coherent philosophy there.
Yeah, I think, I don't want to get too far into this, but just since you mentioned him, I think Michael Brunner is a really sort of interesting and also slightly tragic element to the whole thing, because, I think for years he either was kept away from knowing about Charlie and or was caught up in the helter-skelter narrative to the point that he just didn't want to find out more. But it really seems like in, very recent years, the more he's learned, the more he's really sort of felt a connection to the saner people attached to Charlie,
Well,
and your narrative of what happened with Charlie. And I think he's, he seems like a really genuine guy, especially when, you go to YouTube and you look in the comment sections, and instead of people saying all the horrible stuff that they say every time somebody related to Charlie comes up with him, it's like, just, everybody seems sympathetic to Michael Brunner
right.
in comments.
And he of course is his own person, and he's very different than Charlie, but I see in him many of Charlie's positive attributes and none of the negative ones.
Yeah.
And people who think I'm this great, fan of Charlie, he had lots of negative traits that made pretty much his own worst enemy. He had a lot of self-destructive, violent, and moody temperamental traits. Michael has none of that, but he does have a lot of his playfulness and wit and intelligence that, and there's a lot that, even though Charlie only raised him for a very brief time, he is definitely Charlie's son, but in a good way. And Charlie even said that to me and a few others. I mean, because he did always talk of Michael with great affection. For Charlie, who really was quite bitter about almost everyone, he spoke very fondly and lovingly of him and said he's better than I am.
Yeah, and so now I guess I'd like to talk a little bit specifically about the sort of the word shamanism being connected with Charlie, and also his I believe this was his first contact with psychedelics while he was in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could sort of speak a little bit in that direction for a few minutes.
Right. Well, in 1960, during this sojourn in Mexico, when, for people who may not know the whole ins and out of the story, he was pimping some girls in Texas and New Mexico, and then he fled. He was a wanted man, and he crossed the border into Mexico. and he loved Mexico. I mean, and that he always said that he said two things were the beginning of his spiritual initiation: this experience in the cell where he became dead, and he said the spiritual trip began in Mexico. And he, like, that was his favorite experience in his life. He kept referring to the Mexican sojourn that was very brief. I think it was very important to him. And one of the things he encountered was in a part of Mexico where they're the Yaqui Indians, who also wander into Arizona and New Mexico and other parts of North America. The Yaqui Indians. Now, he clearly had probably been influenced by a famous article in Life magazine at that time about the wonderful properties of psilocybin, because before the hippie movement, people forget, the mainstream media was pushing psychedelics as a miracle drug. And at that moment, I believe the timing of that trip, he had read this article. So he was looking for psilocybin, and supposedly the Yaquis had it. And his Mexican gangster friends, these cholos that Charlie was hanging around, they were frightened of the Yaqui Indians and their fierceness. They said, "Oh no, don't go near them." And Charlie recklessly entered Yaqui land with a gun, with a magnum. And you can read about the whole incident that happened in the book. But he wanted to get this psychedelic experience from them, and he did. And according to what a Mexican police official told me, the Yaquis never let a gringo or a white man enter into their tribal world at all. And so these gangsters were shocked that Charlie managed to ingratiate himself with the Yaquis, who were feared by Mexican gangsters, who were tough then, even before the very formidable drug syndicates of today. But they were, these were brutal banditos that Charlie was hanging around. They were frightened, and they respected Charlie that he would go there and become part of it. But what happened, he apparently freaked out during one of these mushroom trips. And the Yaqui Indians hated the government, hated the Mexican government, and considered it a colonial oppression. They called the police, the federales, and said, "You got to get this maniac out of here." And they were holding him down, and so that's how extreme whatever he did. I don't really know the details. I wish I could get the actual records. They delivered him to the federales because he was just being. You can imagine what would Charlie Manson's first mushroom trip be like, if I think you can picture it. So that was too much for the Yaqui Indians. But he also connected very much to the Aztec. I mean, he went to Tehuetican, the city of the gods, where this pyramid of the sun and the moon are. He very much connected to the shamanic tradition. And you were getting into, how is Charlie a shaman? I think in a very Mexican way, a curandero, a healer, and deeply connected to nature.
Yeah.
And in the book, I say that his seeing himself as a mirror. Anyone who knows anything about Charlie's mystical ideas knows he constantly said, "I'm just a mirror," and he really was. He really did reflect what was around him. But that the important thing to Mexico there is that the Aztec god Tezcatlipoca is called Smoking Mirror, and he is a mirror. And actually, that's the black scrying tool that occultists connected John Dee. That was actually an Aztec scrying mirror connected to the Aztec god Tezcatlipoca. So I
that's
believe
an interesting connection. Yeah.
Yeah. So I believe Charlie picked up a lot of this Aztec. I think he had it in him karmically. He really responded to it. And, people who think of him as purely this white supremacist racist might be surprised to know how much he admired Mexico and Mexican culture very, very deeply.
Yeah, before I want to keep talking about the shamanism element, but I want to read a little excerpt here from the book that apparently this was a letter that Charlie wrote to you. Mother Tree knows my feelings, for I can feel her branches, and I know my own life in and out, around, up and down, through and without. Yes, Sister C feels me as I feel her waves, and I hear the cries of the wildlife. A perfect mother knows I feel the wood being cut, and I hurt, and die with the trees falling. How much a beast must I be to defeat the beast that destroys my mother? The North Sea is dying. The ice caps are melting faster than ever. The lichen is dying on the rock, and I feel it all as my life. I can't help it. I was bound to feel it, and I feel it all, and she cries out at me, and I love the snake, bird, trees, and wolves, Atwa, but humans bore me, and are as aware as a slug, and slow as a snail, and under it all. Can you speak a little bit about the word lichen and how this passage would resonate with a shaman?
Well, I mean, that was just in the midst of a standard letter, of which he sent me many. I mean, that wasn't like he sat down to write a prose piece. That's what came out of his mind just
I thought that was
spontaneously.
incredible.
No, it's beautiful. I mean, if you didn't know, if you quoted that to any group of esoteric people, they would like it and they would respond to it. And then if you told them who wrote it, they'd be horrified.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't make the connection. Well, wait, if he wrote this, maybe he's not the person you think he is. They wouldn't go that far. But that was, that was a very admirable thing about Charlie, his natural poetry, his way with words and language, even though he was not educated and not well read. I mean, to me, that's just, I mean, I could have filled the book with thousands of examples like that. And again, I hear a lot of people say, well, that was just bullshit to whitewash that he's a criminal and he tried to sound like an environmentalist, but he wasn't really. Believe me, he was obsessed with ecology and environmentalism and animal rights, and he felt the misery of animals being killed for meat. He thought about it all the time. Even though, again, and I always point out, he was a little hypocritical. Occasionally in prison, where you have a terrible choice of food, he would occasionally eat a little chicken or meat, even though he was very strict with others about vegetarianism. And we quarreled about that a bit. Like I said, you have to stick to it completely. And he wasn't raised that way. So occasion, and also very, very limited choice in prison. But I mean, I can't stress how much this was important to him. And people who think he was just a con man who told people what they want to hear, no, he bored people to death who could care less about hearing about saving trees and the ocean and animals. And I mean, humorously, I saw a lot of people who were just attracted to him because of the most sensational, stupid reasons, because, oh, he's this notorious mass murderer, pretend that they were interested in environmentalism, which is they weren't.
Yeah.
To get along with him, because it was crucial to him. I mean, and that is very shamanic. Also, how was he a shaman? In that I mean, this is another thing, the cliche, he didn't take LSD as much as the girls so that he could, manipulate them. Well, in fact, that was something that even the leading psychedelic psychologists of the time said, there needs to be someone there to be the guide to help people into the other world. You can't all be on the same level. So, and that's what he did. And that's what a curandero or a shaman helps to introduce people into the spiritual world through the use of these power medicines, or entheogens, as they would call them. And that's what he did. He was a guide into the spiritual world at a time when many people were interested in the spiritual world. Now we live, I mean, it's unimaginable for people who didn't experience the 60s how society really changed, not in this new age superficial way that you see people interested in esotericism, but people really had a desperate yearning for a deeper truth. And whether you want to believe it or not, whether he was a criminal or not, and whether he did horrible things by most ethical standards or not, he was a very effective and wise guide into the spiritual world. And like shamans, he was totally terrible at dealing with the practical world, with the world of contracts and human dynamics and all of that. He was, how do things work? He was like a wild animal, like a feral being who had never been exposed to society. So he was impractical on that level, but when it came to spiritual things, he was a guide and he was very wise. So those are aspects of shamanism, his total connection to the animal kingdom. And he said it over and over again. I'm a coyote, I'm a wolf, I'm a lizard, I'm a scorpion. I'm not a human being. And he wasn't. And I know that most people will think that's crazy, but he wasn't. There was something, and when I say inhuman, I don't mean it in an insulting way. When you were with him in person, there was something, as I describe in the book, of the fairy realm, of of an elf or leprechaun, something like that, which in the ancient world, people understood that there are people who are not wholly of this world. And he was certainly one of them. And he himself was baffled by what he is and how to deal with it.
Yeah.
But so, and that's what a shaman is too, a bridge for humans, for the tribe between the spiritual world and the human world. Another thing about him that's controversial, but is his ambiguous sexuality is very typical. To become a shaman, a man has to become a woman in a strange way. And I'm not talking about it in a woke trans way, which totally would pervert what we're talking about. It is that you have to connect to your feminine side, which is what makes magic happen, which is something you see in the tantric left-hand path as well. Charlie was an ambisexual being. He didn't, even though he was weirdly very much about being a man and how a man is, he also had this feminine side, which many people pointed out is what made him attractive to women, because he could, and even though he was weirdly misogynistic, like everything I say about him could be contradicted with another facet of him, but he had this feminine side, which he was the first to admit. And that too is very typical of when you become a shaman, you partially become the other gender. Because women are the sorceress, the witch, and you know his fascination with witchery and the whole idea of a witch. So those are standard degrees of being a shaman. And as I point out in the book, if you don't get the training, this is true in traditional societies too, if you're born to be a shaman, but you don't get the training to actually become one, if you don't live your destiny to be the tribal shaman, then you get sick. You get kind of mentally ill. And I believe that some of Charlie's disturbances and anger and problems with the world came from because he could not fully develop his spiritual potential. I think that's, and they call that the shamanic sickness. And very often when you become a shaman, you become very ill, and you have to go through this long, dark night of the soul in which you're purified, and then you come out of it like a phoenix from the ashes, reborn. And I think that process didn't work totally for Charlie, because how could it? In prison and in the criminal underworld is not the ideal place for that.
Yeah. And so the second to the last thing that I'd like to talk with you about here today is, what is Abraxas? What are Charlie's connections to it? And then if you would also like to add in there a little bit, talk about what your project is in relation to that, if you have anything to say on that at this time.
Just so you know, I was going to say, now, how have we gone this far without mentioning Abraxas? So I'm glad that you did. I mean, Abraxas,
speaking of wrong shoulder, Abraxas, this is the image right here over my shoulder of Abraxas that people can see.
Right. Well, one of the reasons that I got in touch with Charlie, part of it was just a pragmatic desire to put out one of his recordings as a musician. I noticed his references to Abraxas long ago, a very long time ago, and I believe I'm the first person to even have mentioned them or write about them in the first Manson File in 1988. Other than his music and our connection to lycanthropy and the wolf, I mean, we have a very strong bond about our connection to the wolf. That were things that brought us together right away. He wrote this letter to me, The Way of the Wolf, which I include in the book, which, like that shamanic poetic writing you read, is very much in that spirit. I would recommend. I think a lot of people skip the parts of my book in which I'm quoting long passages of Charlie, because I think, well, that's just Charlie's mumbo jumbo. They're very important to understanding him. So The Way of the Wolf was one thing that connected to us, this weird connection that we have of the animal totem, the wolf. But I was always fascinated with Abraxas, and I get into that in my forthcoming book, which I hope to be the definitive book about Abraxas. So from my childhood, I had this unexplainable obsession with Abraxas, and I was very surprised as I started looking into Charlie's ideas right after the Squeaky Fromm incident with Gerald Ford is when I seriously, as a teenager, started trying to figure out, well, what are these people? I never knew they were interested in environmentalism or animal rights or things that I was deeply concerned with at the time. So I looked into it and saw his mentions of Abraxas and thought, well, where the hell does this come from? And so that was what I would say above all, that was our connection. That's what I really wanted to know about. And he was very mysterious about it. I'm not at all satisfied that he ever explained where he got that from. And if you read my book, of course, I do get into what his story was, that he had written to Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy in Spandau prison, and said, how do you survive in prison? And according to Charlie, he got a letter with only one word back, Abraxas. Now, I believed that when he said that in 2009 or something, I think, and he told a few other people basically that story. But then I checked into Spandau prison's rules and protocol, and actually Hess wasn't allowed to write to another prisoner or to anyone. So I think that was probably a metaphoric explanation of Abraxas, and I think it's connected to, and this is how Charlie thought, if you knew him, you'd see these poetic wordplay parallels. I think he was referring to Hermann Hesse, who wrote the novel Demian about Abraxas, and like merging him with Rudolf Hess. And he was very much into word, like a word means the same thing, like the magical correspondences of sound. So that's my theory. I do think that his particular concept of Abraxas came from Hermann Hesse's novel Demian, which he may or may not have read. He may have heard about it from some of the more educated girls in the commune or somebody, because his ideas are definitely the Jungian ideas that Hermann Hesse has about Abraxas. So, but Abraxas was central to his understanding. He says during the court, there's another father that you don't know about. And that's a very Gnostic idea. And I'm not going to get into the entire Gnostic cosmology here, but the idea that Yahweh is a false god, Yaldabaoth, and that there is a transcendent Godhead, Abraxas, who is the true God and ruler of this world system that we're in. He believed that completely. Now, where he learned the basics of Gnosticism remains a mystery to me, but that is really the way he saw the world. And crucial to his understanding was everything is its opposite. And that is very much a part of Carl Jung's teaching about Abraxas, which comes from his Red Book. And it was, it's in the 7th Sermon of the Dead, if you're familiar with Jung, which I'm sure you are. So Charlie's ideas are not completely accurate to what the ancient Gnostics believed, but they are totally a reflection of Carl Jung and Hermann Hesse's understanding, which is that Abraxas is the unity of all things. Now, that's simplified into God and the devil, which he definitely said they're the same thing, but he would have said everything is the same thing. So from the Abraxan point of view that Charlie had, all opposites are each other. Love is hate. Hate is love. That sounds like hippie mumbo jumbo to somebody who hasn't experienced it from within, but he meant it. He meant your enemy is your best friend. Your best friend is your enemy. Whatever you can think of, the opposite is true. And this gets back to non-dualism and seeing the ambiguity and the fluidity of reality, that nothing is firm and fixed, that everything could be its opposite. And frankly, even that he could think murder could be love, which sounds like madness. But actually, this author Zahner, who wrote the one book that tried to take Charlie seriously as a mystic, Our Savage God, that's really the only book before the Manson File that even took him seriously as a spiritual thinker at all. Even though it's wrong, Zahner, who was a professor of religious studies and theology and Eastern mysticism and Greek philosophy, he understood Charlie was basically a mystic, saying all things are one. And but the linear mind says, oh, God and devil, well, that must have come from the process church, and that's how he taught people to murder with these cult techniques. And it gets reduced to the stupidest sensational level. But if you look at the Jungian concept of Abraxas, it is all opposites combine into this unity. So,
yeah, well,
and as far as my project, I won't, there's no use talking about what will be in it, but it's been a lifelong obsession of mine, Abraxas, long before I met Charlie. And as I say, most people's interest in Charlie is what happened on those nights that made him infamous. That was not my main interest, and it still isn't. I'm very happy not to talk about that for a change. How did this, uneducated prisoner become so much an avatar of Abraxas? That's what interested me.
Yeah, and if people are, really digging this conversation, they're going to love these sections of your book because we are barely scratching the surface, There's and that's why I wanted to sort of save Abraxas for towards the end of the interview, because it really to me seems like Abraxas is kind of the culmination of all of his different life experiences and religious experiences.
It's
And on
the
top of
key.
that, it's a very still a very elusive concept. That's why I'm looking forward to your book, because even the mentions of this god are few and far between, even to this day.
Well, there's a Sufi saying, the secret protects itself.
Yes.
And because I think Abraxas is so infinitely important to our cosmos and our reality, it's very strange that there's very little written about him that's real, that's really well researched or solid, and people don't quite grasp it. It's there. And so one thing I point out in my book, it's very prevalent in German culture. It is extremely mainstream here in Germany. Goethe mentioned Abraxas early on. Of course, Hermann Hesse, one of German language's major novelists, is very well known to have mentioned Abraxas in great depth in his novel Demian. And Carl Jung, one of the great German psychologists, or maybe more philosopher and mystic than psychologist, so it's in Germany, and also a lot of ancient research into the ancient gems of Abraxas were German scholars. So there's a weird karmic connection to Germany and Abraxas, which I can't explain. And I was actually, the reason I wrote this book about Abraxas, I was going to give a lecture at the World Gothic Treffen. This was the third time I was going to give a lecture about Abraxas that was canceled by some weird circumstance. Once the place I was going to give the lecture actually started crumbling, like some Lovecraftian mold destroyed it. We couldn't do that. And then so I was going to give a lecture when I gave a concert at the Wave Gothic Treffen in 2020. And then this little thing called the pandemic came along and canceled it. So after 3 cancellations, I said, let me just write everything I've learned about Abraxas in a book, which is what most of my books are. Is I think, all right, people ask about this so much, I better define it exhaustively. So, I mean, people who only know me through the Manson world, that I do many more things than that. But far more interesting to me is, who is God? And I'm answering that question. It is Abraxas from a certain point of view, if you really want to understand it in depth. That's more important to me than how many stab wounds at Cielo Drive,
Yeah. Yeah, and the same here.
Right.
So,
Now, I did want to bring up one thing that I mentioned in the book, if we have time, is just that we didn't get into is, and I pointed out in the introduction, if you get into the world of Mansonism, this amazing amount of synchronicities that occur, which I call in the book Element X, because I don't have any explanation for it. I think that's a very important part of describing the Manson phenomenon in the Manson File that I don't really think anyone else has covered. So I just wanted to add that for people that have noticed that. I know that many people who get into this field or even start looking at it, it starts looking back at you by sending you symbols and signals from what Charlie would call the universal mind. So that I think is an important part of my spiritual understanding of, and that's even beyond Charlie. I think Charlie himself was baffled by it. He knew it, he saw it, and he was mystified by why it was. And I think you see from reading the part of the book that you read, he himself didn't have a clear explanation of why he was who he was. He struggled with that. He often asked, how did this happen to me? Why am I this person? He didn't know any more than anyone else does. So there was that element of mystery to him.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think the last thing I'd like to ask you about today is the hallways of always. I thought that would be an appropriate way to sort of play out our interview.
Mm-hmm. Well, Charlie's particular concept of his life in prison is that he was out of time. He didn't have to get up. I mean, he had to get up, but he didn't have any responsibilities for most of his life. And so prison is like a no time. It's like eternity. And he often mentioned many times how, it totally fucks with your mind. I mean, he was aware enough of the outside world to know what it would be like to be a non-criminal, non-convict civilian. But he'd point out, for instance, you see a guard one day and he's a young man. Then you realize, wait, he's middle-aged now. How did I miss that? Because years go by in this. And so again, that was like, he saw that as an advantage. People say they were crazy. They didn't have watches on the Spawn Ranch. Well, that's a very typical mystical approach, that there is no time. So the hallways of the always, he felt like this weird condition of timelessness that happens when you're incarcerated, because every day is pretty much exactly the same day you had before, and you lose track of time. And he saw that as an advantage, and he saw that as something that taught him how to deal with the outer world, because he felt he was truly X from this world because of his prison experience, but also that there was no time for him. Now, of course, as a human being, he was completely irresponsible because of that. If the Beach Boys wanted him to show up at this time for a session, he wouldn't and didn't, and fucked up any possibility of a normal musical career because of that. But he was tuned in to the timelessness of the universe, and he was very much not on a clock, not an employee who would, and then that was very important to him. So that's the hallways of the always. It was like prison is eternity, forever. It could seem like hell to someone who resists this and hates it, but to him, it was a kind of heaven.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think this will pretty much wrap our interview up then. I really appreciate your time speaking with me again here today, this time about, this whole Charles Manson topic, aside from the crime elements, which are just,
Right.
You've been through so much detail with that. So I really appreciate you
Well,
taking this time today.
I mean, I've said so much about that. I don't have a hell of a lot more to say. It's, as you see, it's all in the book. I mean,
Yeah.
I could have written 9 more volumes, but the essence of what you need to know is in the book. And like this interview that concentrates on mysticism, the other interviews I'm going to give will be about his political ideas and environmental ideas, his music, all the other aspects of Charlie that are not covered in most of these books about him, because I'm constantly asked about the crimes, but it is certainly not my primary interest. And I'm happy to discuss them, and I think it's important for history to understand what really happened, but it's not my principal understanding. And I am a spiritual person. I am primarily a mystic and an initiate. And this part of my work is a part of my initiation. It's not true crime in any ordinary sense. And I understand people think that's crazy too. They think any kind of spiritual awareness is some sort of pretentious, pompous act. But and many people out there know, it's what matters. It's what's real.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So I will include any appropriate links into the description below the YouTube video when this goes up. But if there's anything specifically that you'd like to mention of anything upcoming that you want to talk about, or particular places for people to go ahead.
Right. Well, actually, the Manson File finally coming out after these many delays of the pandemic and lockdowns and all of these various nightmare obstacles that occurred, in general is part of a larger program of all of my books being re-released in new editions. So for instance, The Satanic Screen is coming out in a revised, updated edition in many languages. It already came out in a German edition a few years ago. Now there's going to be a French, an Italian, a Spanish edition of The Satanic Screen, which for some people, that's the book that they're interested in. They could care less about Charlie Manson. I mean, another book that I did in 2001, Flowers from Hell, is coming out in a new deluxe, expanded, beautifully made, aesthetic, illustrated edition. And I've got many other books that I'm working on, new books. One of them that's been announced is this book about Abraxas that will come out on Anya Bound, and also editions Pansauf in France and other editions. So all of my work has been revised, updated to put out the final ultimate editions of them. And then I'm moving into a new phase of other nonfiction, which will end with this novel that I've been working on. And then, of course, my music is really probably the most important part of my life, other than my spiritual initiation. So I will be going back into the studio finally after about a year of hiatus, and we'll be recording a new album very soon. So, and most of what I'm doing, you know, I am a total workaholic. I don't have a life other than my work. So if you look in my social media or anti-social media, you'll see what I'm doing. It's what I am. So it's all there.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, I'm really personally looking forward to all of these things that you mentioned. So thank you for your time today. Thanks to everybody that's watched this, and have a great one. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, and many blessings to all of your watchers.